all right, which is chapter 9. So our first objective is to describe the different types of neurons and supporting cells and identify their functions. So again, this is where I think that we have talked about the small details of neurons and how they connect and communicate. And so this is really zooming out and looking at the big picture of how neurons form nerves. So neurons are the smaller units that actually are bundled together to form a nerve. And then some of the additional supporting cells and just the general makeup and layout of the nervous system. All right, so really just zooming out at the big picture and looking more at the anatomy here. So the central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. Those are the two main components. Everything outside of that, so all of your peripheral nerves, all of your peripheral ganglia, we'll talk about what a ganglia is coming up, all of that will be comprising the peripheral nervous system. So the only components that make your central nervous system is the brain itself, and then the spinal cord projection, which is housed in the vertebral column. Now, we know the nervous system is important for maintaining homeostasis, particularly in the feedback loops, right? We talked about how our regulated variables, any changes detected to those variables would be sent on neurons, right? Sent by the nervous system to the integrating centers in the brain, and then responses are sent back down to effector tissues. So very crucial for homeostasis. As far as the number of neurons is about 10 to the 11th power, so about 100 billion neurons on average. And then even more, about 100 trillion synapses, right? So many, many more synapses as far as a single neuron being able to have several different communications with other nervous structures, muscles as well. The nervous system is very, it's all encompassing. There's a lot that we don't understand about it, but it's pretty much responsible for everything about our personality, everything about our character, our memories, our thoughts, our feelings, all of that, the way that we perceive the world, all right, the way that we interact with the world, all of that is conducted and housed and facilitated through communication with the nervous system, all right? So it's really important to understand that this is not just a structure in our body, it's really the map, if you will, and the way that we can communicate with the world, perceive the world, think thoughts, form memories, have emotional connections to things. There's a lot of other deeper functions ascribed to the nervous system. And again, it's one of the least understood systems, and it's kind of a fascinating concept, right? We're using our human brain to try to make sense of the human brain. It's really a fascinating concept. And so there's a lot that we still don't quite understand. There's a lot of theories floating around that we haven't quite proven as far as understanding this nervous system. So it's the least understood system in our body. Some of the structures are neurons, which are the main cells. These are the cells that have the ability to fire action potentials and to send signals and synapses. Then there are glial cells. Glial cells are not electrically active as such. Glial cells are more supporting cells. We're also going to talk about the physical structures of the nervous system, like the skull, the meninges. We will talk about the blood supply to the brain. That's really important, and how that can be a challenge as far as strokes and things like that. We'll talk about the blood-brain barrier, and then we'll talk about the difference between gray matter and white matter. All right, so a lot of the structural components of the nervous system. Let's start by looking at neurons themselves. So these are the structural and functional units of the nervous system. The main role of neurons is to respond to chemical and physical stimuli. So again, these can be stimuli or signals that are physical, right? So pressure, detecting change in pressure and temperature and that sort of thing, but also chemical. Okay, we talked about the fact that a synapse is an action potential resulting in neurotransmitter release. That's what's happening at the synaptic junction. So the chemicals released there can also cause responses on the adjacent cells as well. So this is what allows us to conduct electrochemical impulses, i.e. the action potential, which is the way that the nervous system communicates. It's kind of the language of the nervous system. And that results in the release of chemical regulators, which we know to be neurotransmitters. And it can be other things as well, like hormones. And again, this enables a lot of what we know or what we ascribe as functioning. So perception, learning, controlling our muscles, controlling glandular secretions, some of our reactions, right? So our fight or flight response is facilitated by the nervous system. Our parasympathetic rest and digest response is facilitated through the nervous system as well. Now, most neurons do not have the ability to divide. This is why it's really important to protect the nervous system. And you'll notice this in the anatomical structure, that the brain is housed in that very hard protective casing. The spinal cord is also housed in that very hard protective casing, because the nervous system and neurons are very delicate structures. They don't have the ability to divide. They can repair, but over a very long period of time, they can eventually re-stimulate, regenerate, and repair, but not divide in that they can very readily and quickly multiply again. All right. Now we can classify neurons based on structure or based on function. Structural classification will be depending on how many axon processes are extending from the soma of the neuron. So we can have unipolar neurons, pseudopolar neurons, multipolar neurons, which will have a lot of different locations and different functions. Now, as far as the functional classification, we can divide neurons based on what type of role they play in the nervous system communication. So we have sensory neurons, which would, as the name implies, these would perceive certain sensory stimuli. So we can have olfactory, we can have visual, on the retina neurons that detect sight. We have proprioception that can detect pressure and that sort of thing. So sensory neurons will be perceiving information from the world around us. Motor neurons, on the other end, will be involved in functioning with muscle. So they're going to be stimulating muscle movement, and these will be specifically called motor neurons, and these will help innervate our skeletal muscle. And then the third classification is an interneuron. Interneuron just relay a connection between sensory and motor neurons. So this is basically the small neuron in the spinal cord itself that will help to bridge that gap. It will pick up information from the sensory neuron and then relay it to a motor neuron. Interneurons are really important in things like reflexes. So if I touch a hot stove, automatically, without even going to my brain, without even sending that signal to the cognitive part of my brain, an interneuron takes that sensory information, passes it to a motor neuron, and I can move my hand without even really thinking about it. So interneurons help to quickly bridge that gap between sensory and motor neurons. All right, so again, the functional classification here. So we've got a sensory neuron. So notice this has receptors out in the periphery. This will be like the skin, maybe the GI tract to detect pressure or chemicals coming through, and then they will send that information to the spinal cord. And then here we can see an interneuron picking up that sensory information and then sending it to another motor neuron. And then we have motor neurons, which go to skeletal muscles, and those will help to move skeletal muscles. We'll talk a lot about that in chapter 11. And then autonomic neurons, which go to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular tissue. So basically, these are the motor neurons that are not necessarily controlled voluntarily. So these are functions that we don't think about controlling, like our heart rate, like our respiratory rate, like glandular secretion, but they are in fact still associated with the motor neuron, but it is just a part of the autonomic nervous system, which is not voluntarily controlled by us, right? Whereas the skeletal muscle is voluntarily controlled. Okay, so those are just some examples of the functional classification of neurons. Let's move on to our other types of cells. So we'll talk about the glial cells next. And glial cells is a collective term which includes all of the supporting cells for our neurons. So our neurons are the excitable cells. These are the cells that have the ability, because of the voltage-gated sodium channels that are on these neurons, these have the ability to elicit the action potentials. Our glial cells do not have the ability to elicit action potentials. They are regular cells, they are non-excitable, and their main role is just supporting neurons. And we'll talk about the different types of examples of how that support is offered. Now, about 75 to 90% of the central nervous system is actually made of neuroglia, which is basically the supporting cells. So a very small percent of the nervous system is actually by excitable cells, and then a lot of that is just going to be supporting cells. So there are 5 types of glial cells. Astrocytes, these have a lot of different functions, but it's really nice to think about the shape of these cells and associate that with their name. So these are star-shaped cells. So here's what an astrocyte looks like. It's got all of these foot processes that stick out, and this almost appears like a star, hence the term astrocyte. Ependymal cells line our cavities, so the internal brain cavities, the ventricular spaces, those are going to be lined by ependymal cells. So here is an example of the ventricular cavity, and the cavities hold cerebrospinal fluid. We'll talk more about those cavities coming up, but they are lined by these ependymal cells. And as you would imagine here, ependymal cells actually make cerebrospinal fluid. So we'll talk about that connection coming up, but those are what these cells help to support with. Microglia are basically phagocytes, and phagocytes are cells that have engulfing properties. They can eat or engulf other cells, and so they're going to help protect the nervous system from bacteria, from viruses, any other pathogen. Oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells are the myelinating cells of the nervous system. And so we talked about the function of myelin. We talked about the saltatory conduction, so the ability of action potentials to leap from junction to junction. And so that would mean that there's myelin along the length of that neuron. And so these two cells help to lay down that myelin, and oligodendrocytes form myelin in the central nervous system, whereas Schwann cells form myelin out in the peripheral nervous system. All right, so we'll talk about each of these cells more in detail one by one and what their role is to support the neurons themselves. So astrocytes, as we mentioned, star-like shape, and that star-like shape is going to be really connected to its function. So astrocytes help to form what's called the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is pretty much a wall of defense between what is happening in the vascular, the circulatory system, and what is happening in the nervous system, in our neurons and the nervous tissue. So the astrocytes act like a checkpoint, right? A security checkpoint or a gatekeeper, if you will. They pretty much stand in between these two structures and monitor any exchange, so that any pathogen, any bacteria, any byproduct or metabolic byproducts from medications, some of those things are harmful or toxic to neurons. And again, neurons are very delicate. The nervous system is very delicate, and it has a lot of defense features or defense mechanisms, and this is one of them. So the astrocytes have foot processes that are standing on the capillaries that are in the brain and standing on the neurons that are in the brain and pretty much regulating any communication, such that, let's say you have a viral infection and it's circulating in your capillaries, in your blood, that is not allowed to cross over into the brain by way of this blood-brain barrier formed by the astrocytes. Another thing that astrocytes can possibly do is modulate synaptic activity. So this brings up something we discussed before. If you remember us talking about presynaptic modulation, which could be inhibition or facilitation, which was a modulating neuron or a modulating cell that could encourage or disencourage more or less neurotransmitter being released at the synaptic junction. So astrocytes can also act in that way. And again, notice here, they're not They are not electrical cells. And remember, we said that these modulating neurons have no electrical activity that is involved at the synapse. All they do is encourage more of the vesicles to be exocytosed, and then more of that neurotransmitter to be released, or if it's inhibition, less of that to occur. So that is another role that astrocytes can play in the nervous system as well. All right. Some additional roles for astrocytes: they can remove excess neurotransmitter, things like glutamate or even GABA, which can be highly toxic if they are left in excess at the synaptic junction. So astrocytes can help to clean up some of that neurotransmitter debris. They can maintain normal electrolyte levels of the interstitial fluid and the fluid around the nervous tissue, especially the levels of potassium. So potassium needs to be very heavily regulated in the interstitial fluid. We know that in the ECF, there should be a certain level of potassium and sodium. And so astrocytes help to keep those levels balanced in the interstitial fluid that is sort of bathing the neurons. And then again, it's going to protect neurons against toxic substance, oxidative stress, any harmful byproducts of anything that's circulating in our general circulation. And then lastly, astrocytes can help with glycogen synthesis. So the brain is very sensitive to its energies, to its source of energy. The brain very much prefers to have glycogen and glucose specifically as its source of energy. It doesn't do well with fats as a source of energy. And so having the ability to synthesize glycogen, which can be converted into glucose very easily, is another role of astrocytes. All right, so astrocytes, again, protecting the neurons from harmful substances. I think we moved on to microglia. So microglia, moving on to the phagocytic cells of the nervous system. And when we say phagocytic, these cells have the ability to eat other particles or foreign matter that is in the nervous system. Bacteria, injured cells, old senescent or dying cells, any type of harmful substance or toxic substance can be engulfed in the nervous system by way of the microglia. So a sort of a different role from the astrocytes. Astrocytes aren't going to eat or engulf or destroy these toxic substances. It's just going to stand in the way and protect them from entering the nervous system. But if they do make their way into the nervous tissue, microglia are going to be the cells that help to engulf and destroy those those foreign particles or foreign matter. All right. So in a very different way, it's also going to protect the central nervous system from these toxic substances as well as from any oxidative stress. All right. Now, there are a few clinical connections that we can make here as far as glial cells and some of the neurodegenerative diseases. For example, multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis, or MS, is a demyelinating neurodegenerative disease. And so this is a disease where there's gradually a loss of myelin throughout the nervous system. And as you would imagine, that loss of myelin slows down the synaptic communication, slows down the signaling between neurons. And the way that that presents clinically is basically loss of function, sometimes numbness, tingling, weakness in the peripheral nervous system. And then eventually that can make its way to the central nervous system and result in things like vision changes, in other, memory loss, and other neurodegenerative findings. So multiple sclerosis is basically a loss of myelin throughout the nervous system, starting in the periphery with the Schwann cells and peripheral myelin, and then eventually making its way to the central nervous system, oligodendrocytes. Alzheimer's is another connection or disease that has some connection to glial cells. So Alzheimer's is basically the loss of cholinergic neurons, and cholinergic neurons are neurons that release acetylcholine. And we talked about acetylcholine as being one of the most abundant neurotransmitters in the body. And so basically, when we lose cholinergic neurons, we lose the ability to to form memory, to access that memory, to have functioning, to have reasoning, to have judgment. A lot of the clinical manifestations that we see with Alzheimer's patient. So this normal cholinergic neuron is replaced by a lot of plaque and scar tissue in the brain. And so if you look at the brain, brain imaging of an Alzheimer's patient and the brain imaging of a normal adult or normal patient, you'll see a loss of the brain matter, loss of the the actual brain structure, and more spaces filling in between that. So basically loss of brain matter as there's loss of cholinergic neurons. And then again, that's going to result in cognitive decline, loss of memory, etc. Parkinson's disease is another type of neurodegenerative disease. It's very similar to Alzheimer's. This is where we lose dopaminergic neurons. And dopaminergic neurons are more involved in movement. So with Parkinson's patients, we can see loss of cognitive decline. That's going to be towards the end. What we'll see first as the initial presentation is a change in movement. So Parkinson's patients will start to move very, very slow. They will start to have the shuffling gait. They'll start to kind of shuffle just because dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters and dopaminergic neurons help us to inhibit our movement and help us to have fine, smooth pursuit, right? So when I attempt to move something, that should be a smooth, uninterrupted action. But a Parkinson's patient is going to have a little bit of shuffling, a little bit of static movement as they make to move something because of that loss of that dopaminergic contribution of the nervous system. So these patients will have a movement presentation initially, whereas Alzheimer's patient will have a cognitive presentation initially.